Hello again and welcome to the chapter about dealing with sacrifices. This is one of the most difficult areas within defensive play simply because the choice involved it's so delicate, it's so committal, because if we accept the sacrifice that our opponent just launched, well, we might up getting mated. On the other hand, if we decline it, we might give them an attack for free, so to speak. They play without risk because they didn't sacrifice anything to get there in the first place. So it's a very interesting topic. I have tried to look at it from different angles, but before checking the examples, I would talk very briefly about some general guidelines. In the first place, I would recommend that we always look at the acceptance of the sacrifice when we face it, because if we can actually accept it, it means that they don't get that attack for free. And also, as for the practical aspect of this choice, if we can really accept it, we don't need to check other options. So in that sense, it's very practical if we can accept it. Like, we can simply use the process of elimination to establish that if we let them get away with this, it's just too much for us. So very often it's actually advisable to accept it because we can suffer a little, we have some extra material if we can stay alive, so to speak. But of course, there are situations where it's completely impossible to accept the sacrifice. We might see that we get mated by force, and then of course we will have to decline it instead. But in general terms, there are no rules really for this, but a first step would always be to check if we can actually accept it. Also, you could say that if they can put a piece, let's say they take on h7 with the bishop, they are actually playing a move which was not supposed to work. They are like breaking the rules. They are putting a piece where it can be taken, which means that it's like a shortcut to activity, you could say. So it's of course true that sometimes these sacrifices, they take us with surprise. We can be surprised by them, and in that case we need to be really, you could say, pragmatic, and we should think about any possibility. But in other occasions, I would say that since a sacrifice, it's a little like breaking the rules. They're doing something that they're not supposed to be able to. There is a fair chance that it's actually not working, their sacrifice. But on the other hand, you could also claim that, just like in chapter 19, when one side is attacking and they have all the pieces lined up for the attack, it might be a logical consequence of their play, the sacrifice, because that's how it culminates, you could say. Their attack is a logical consequence of their attack. So many aspects, many ways to look at this. I think it's time to have a look at our examples. What I have done here, I have started with some examples where the best choice is actually to accept the sacrifice. Then we have a few examples where it's preferable to decline it. And then I think I have a few opening examples. And finally, I think there is one endgame example as well. So let's get started. In our first example, we have the typical situation where the opponent launches the Greek gift. Here in this game between Charbonneau with white and Al-Ali with black pieces, in a French situation, in French position, white played here, bishop takes h7. This was not a good choice, and I invite you to try to establish what was wrong with bishop takes h7. What do you think might happen here? That's right. You could see one of the ways to analyze this situation with the Greek gift is that if we can cover the square on h7 with a piece later on, which is not a king, this usually means that we're winning, because they are trying to mate us on that square. They'll try to play knight e5 and queen h5 and so on. They want to mate us here. If we can cover this square with one piece, it's usually the end to the Greek gift. One way to do it, of course, would be to use a knight on f8 or on f6. Another way is to bring a bishop to this diagonal in some way. However, none of this is really possible here. But in the game, Al-Ali, he noticed another way to get there. So what do you think he played? Of course, he accepted the sacrifice because, not because I told you that in the first part of the chapter we will look at this, but simply because I told you it's the first thing to look at. So king takes h7 after knight g5 check. If we're able to cover that square, we should usually go back with the king. So that's what he did here. If you go up with the king instead, as you can see, it's very dangerous. I think you get mated here after queen d3, right? Something around h7. We don't have f5. That's good to see also. So king g8, and after queen h5, black found a way to bring a piece to touch that square. Exactly, you're right. Queen a5 check, and after whatever they play, king d1 was played here. We have queen f5. Black is covering the h7 square confidently with the queen. White tried g4 and black played queen g6. And I was going to say black won, but actually white had resigned already after queen a5 check. I think here they noticed what happened and they resigned. So this was a very nice little defensive maneuver, you could say. Mobilization to the defense. The queen got in exactly the right place, and White's Greek gift didn't work out. A simple example about when a sacrifice is not working and when we should actually accept it as our first priority. Bishop takes h7. We should take it because we can then bring our queen to safeguard the king in this way. Let's have a look at our next example. It's again about a Greek gift. We're playing with the black pieces. Black just castled here, and again white went for the Greek gift. I played here bishop takes h7 in this game between Kurtsehajic and Dizdarevic. Bishop takes h7. It was not the right choice, and I'm convinced that you know why. We should accept the sacrifice. If you, for example, if you decline it, you play something like king h8. It's usually a very bad idea because they will go back with the bishop, they have an extra pawn, they can play for an attack in many different ways. We don't have something to suffer for. So you should only do this if you're really convinced that you're getting mated, I would say. So after bishop takes h7, what Dizdarevic did, he just took on h7, but this time after knight c5, he should not go back anymore because he can't cover this square in a good way. No, king g8, queen h5, as you can see, this would be very dangerous for us. Queen h7 is coming up, we'll have to play rook e8, but then also you can see that the pawn on f7 is hanging. This would be extremely dangerous. I think, I was just thinking about which would be the best way to continue with white here. One way you can sometimes continue here instead of taking the pawn. This should also be very good, and you can even send the rook to the attack. I think another way to play is something like this: queen check, h7, queen h7 check, king f8, queen h8, knight e7, knight h7, king e7, bishop g5. Yeah, I have seen this, and I think this is one of the best choices. It's still a little tricky now. They could play knight f6, but then I think we don't take on f6, we take on g7 instead, right? And the knight is hanging on f7. And obviously if they play f6 instead, we take and it's mate. So yeah, this would be a complete disaster. For this reason, the king should go up. That should be our main idea when we cannot cover the square on h7. That's how I look at this. So white played in the game h4, trying to get h5 in. They could, of course, have tried this typical move, queen g4, but then we can go f5. So one thing to understand here is that since they don't have a pawn on e5, like in the previous example, right? Or they didn't have a pawn on e5. Well, very often you have a pawn on e5 in the Greek gift situations. In that case, white could take on f6, right? E takes f6 after f5. If king takes, that would be rook takes e6 and even mate. But here, since they don't have a pawn on e5, their attack loses great part of its power. They can't really keep up the attack here. Queen h4, trying to give mate. We could simply play here rook h8. And something similar happened in the game. They played h4 in the game, Kurtsehajic, and black simply played here rook h8, preventing h5. White's attack wasn't really working anymore. They tried in the game queen d3, but after the same move, f5, black's king was reasonably safe. You can see that white, they don't have access to this square. Our bishop is there. They tried in the game f4, preparing this move, queen g3. Black hurried to take the pawn, not so much for the pawn, but in order to be able to play rook g4 on the topic of obstruction. Queen g3, rook g4, queen h3. They're about to play queen h7. We could, of course, play something like queen g8, but in the game, Dizdarevic proceeded in a much more practical way. He has an extra piece here, and he has an active game, so he just took on g5 instead. This was very practical to avoid any further issues with, I don't know, maybe white wanted, apart from this threat, they would like to bring the knight like that maybe. So I think what he did was very practical. He took and he played bishop d7. I think then he brought his queen to h8, and actually black had all the play. In this kind of situation, the minor pieces are much stronger than the rook and pawn. Well, I think it's not even a pawn, right? Yeah, black is even material up here, I think. So simple example. They carried out the Greek gift. We took it as a first, you could say, first choice, first thing to look at, first priority. And after knight e5, here it's important, of course, to go up with the king because, yeah, if we go down, we can't cover h7, so we should go up instead. Just make sure that we don't lose instantly. But as you can see here, without the pawn on e5, this is somewhat less threatening to black. So they later on went on to win. Key resource here, the move f5. So that was important. Bring up the king if you can't cover the square on h7. Let's have a look at some other situations apart from the Greek gift I have in our next example. with the white pieces. I have an example where Korchnoi is playing white versus Cheparinov. Korchnoi was a fantastic player in, you could say, in defensive situations. He was known for sometimes grabbing material and sticking to it. He would defend very, very well, very precise defense. And here we have one case. Cheparinov played at this point knight g3 check. So what do you think? Accept or decline? Well, if we decline in the first place, we give up the exchange. We have an extra pawn from the very beginning here. But even so, after king d1, knight takes, white would take back with the bishop, or the queen perhaps to bring in the rook. Black would play something like knight g6, try to put the knight on f4. Black would be slightly up in material, and they are fairly active here. It's easy to see that they have good squares for all their pieces, I would say. I would prefer this if it's possible to accept the sacrifice. And that's what happened in the game after knight g3, Korchnoi took on g3. He had noticed something here, an important detail. It looks very scary at first sight, no? H takes g3, you can see queen h4 is coming next, knight h3 and queen h4. This is the key position when you're sitting at the board. In this position, I mean, you should look at that position. We can do it mentally, of course. When they play knight g3 here, we think h takes, knight h3, queen h4. How should we face the threat of bishop takes h3 next turn? We can't really prevent it. It would be disastrous if they're able to enter with a queen. They would basically mate us on h2, thanks to the pawn on g3. So how would we cope with that situation? Well, there is an intermediate move. Is there any white piece which could threaten the black queen in that situation after h takes, knight h3, queen h4? Aha, there is indeed. The bishop can go to g5, right? We go bishop g5. Let's say they move the queen somewhere like to h5 to keep in contact with the bishop on g5. Aha, you're right. We can then bring in the queen. Queen e1, we're touching the pawn on g3. Even if they take our bishop, sorry, they take our knight with their bishop takes a3, we have queen takes g3, and then we can safely put the queen on h4. Something like that, I think, was what Korchnoi was calculating here when he played h takes g3. H takes, knight h3, queen h4. Here we have the first intermediate move, bishop g5. Actually, I was wrong in my preliminary calculations. If queen h5, this is a bad idea. As you can see, it lets white introduce more pieces. They can play here f4 with a discovered attack. So in the game after bishop g5, Cheparinov played queen h7. And here you have the move that we talked about. White can actually obstruct black on the h-file by playing this very precise move, queen e1. The point is that we are giving back the material. Bishop takes h3, we won't take it because in that case, as you can see, we get mated. Instead, we take the pawn on g3. Like our worst enemy here, that little pawn. We play queen takes g3, and no matter what they play, we are ready to cover here in some way with the queen. So that's what happened in the game. Black played bishop f5. I think queen h2 is better because if you put the queen here, maybe it can get exposed later on. So queen h2 was played in the game. And after queen g6, Korchnoi continued here in active fashion. He played f4, starting to gain some space for his pieces. He's actually interested in playing g4 as well, and getting more space and letting the king reach the g2 square. Knight g4 was played in the game, and after bishop takes, I think here there was a slight mistake. He played in the game rook a1. On general grounds, it's a good move, bringing more pieces to the battle, but rook f7 was very strong here with rook h7. Korchnoi had some problems in this position, but he later on managed to save the draw. Yeah, fantastic defending player, Viktor Korchnoi. But it was actually possible to play in a more precise way here. Queen h4 is very strong because we're trying to play g4, even if it's weakening a little. We like back in the previous chapter about defensive pawn breaks, but here it's more about giving the king some additional space. We would like to have the king on g2 instead. So queen h4, and after bishop e7 or bishop where else could the bishop go? To f5, we will play in the same way. We go g4 here. Interesting move found by the computer, of course. In this way, as you can see after, for example, queen d3, black is trying to avoid getting asphyxiated by f5. Well, we can now bring in the rook d1, and after queen c4, we can play the move f5. Interesting how white just pushes their kingside pawns, but it's not so easy to get at white's king. In any case, this goes a little beyond the initial topic here. What we were talking about is the fact that black sacrificed with knight g3. We would like to take on g3, but it's important to see how to defend against the later queen h4, threatening to go bishop takes h3. And Korchnoi was up to the challenge. He took on g3 because he saw that after h takes, knight takes h3, he had after the move queen h4, he had bishop g5, and later on queen e1 followed by queen takes g3 and ultimately queen h2. So very nice calculation. In this case, definitely you could say in such situations, defense, it's about tactics mainly. So important to see defensive resources such as bringing the queen to the h file to defend. In our next example, we have another very, you could say, outstanding player, Judith Polgar with the white pieces, fantastic attacker, and Alexander Belyavsky, who was one of the best players back in the 1980s. He's defending here with the black side. So what Polgar did here, she played the move knight f5. Very nice move, trying to attack a little more. White has several pieces in the attack. We talked about this. It's natural to go for an attack. So question here, should we take or should we leave the knight on f5? So I think it's actually possible to play in both ways. It's possible to leave it there. I think the computer was saying something that we can just play c5, kick away the knight, and after queen h4 we can take the pawn on e5. But I don't really like this for black. One variation here, knight takes, bishop takes, knight h6 check, king g7 and rook d1. I think it's saying it's about equal, but if you ask me, I definitely prefer white side in this game. One idea that you could have here is maybe knight g4 to play queen h6 or bishop h6. There is something also with knight takes f7 and queen takes f7 coming up. If you defend like Stockfish, you can probably defend this position very successfully with black, but else I would advise you to do what Belyavsky did, check the acceptance of the sacrifice. After knight f5, he actually took on e5. I think he was convinced that he should not let white get away with this move, having the knight on f5. The pawn on g6 was supposed to do exactly that, prevent knight f5 and knight h5. And now they break the rules here. They play knight f5 anyway. So first reaction here should be to accept, and that's what happened in the game. He took on f5, but after bishop takes f5, he actually had to go for a counter sacrifice, similar to what Korchnoi just did, by the way. So he noticed that there is the very strong threat of queen h4. He would not be able to defend the pawn, protect it in a good way, because the knight is pinned right now. So he said, all right, that bishop, it's really a giant. I can't really live with that bishop. It's okay if I give away something to get rid of that bishop. So what do you think he played? Aha, he played here a very nice move, rook e6. Fantastic, because he knew that if he gets the bishop off the board, his defense will be much easier to handle. So rook e6 was played in the game. Now we're ready to go knight f8. White, I think they started first with queen h4. Indeed, we played knight f8. Whenever they take, yeah, we take back. We don't have any big difficulties. After knight d4, bringing in more pieces to the attack, c5 was a clever choice because apart from attacking the knight, this is also one of black's trumps here. They would like to push their pawn majority on the queen side. Rook ac1 and simply queen c7. You can say it's interesting how Polgar doesn't take the rook, and also Belyavsky, he lets the rook stay there. Simply it was pinned now, but now it's unpinned. Now it can move. There is rook takes e5 coming up, so Polgar takes on e6. Taking with the bishop, yeah, we would take with the pawn just as previously. It would make our position very stable. Don't take with the knight, because then obviously white could again put the knight on f5. We always want to avoid this. So f takes e6, black would have a very stable position here. In the game, they took instead with the knight. Black must of course take back with the pawn so as to keep this pawn protected. There was bishop e1, and here Belyavsky simply played rook ac8. As simple as that. Last friend to the party. c4 is coming up next. The king side is very safe for now. We have this kind of goalkeeper on f8. We talked about that in the chapter about mobilization. The knight is excellent on f8, usually for defensive purposes. Knight on f8, no mate, I think that is one saying. So yeah, nice thinking by both players, I would say. Knight f5 was very inventive by Judith Polgar, but Belyavsky noticed that he should take it, not letting the knight enter just like that, but then he should be ready to give back something, because these two threats, queen g4 is also, by the way, I forgot to say that, queen g4 is also a big threat, because they would have bishop h6 coming up next, and we wouldn't have a chance to block, because our knight is still it's still pinned, and also queen g4 obviously is attacking that knight. So there are many reasons why we should play this move, rook e6. Beautiful move. In this way, we get ready to defend with knight f8 later on. All right, let's check another example from the Grunfeld battle in this more modern game with white pieces Tran Tuan Min and playing black Alexienko. So Alexienko has developed rather well, I would say, in this Grunfeld battle. All the pieces are in the battle from black's perspective, but also from white's. And what white noticed is that they can actually go for an attack here. They played rook takes h5, or they can go for a sacrifice, you could say. So what do you think? How should we react to that? Should we accept or should we decline? By the way, do you think there is some kind of third choice? we don't accept and we don't decline, well, by definition there is not. But what we can do sometimes, we can include an intermediate move. We can take it next move. That's what happened in this example, because if you take first d takes h5, they have here bishop h6, and we can't really defend the bishop in a good way. Just for the record here, if you try something like f5, trying to bring up tactical complexities by counter threat and so on, try to play rook e7 next turn, actually queen takes f5 is very strong for white, because also, as you can see now, this pawn is being attacked. So if rook e7, I think white will just take one of these two pieces. I think both are okay, actually. Yeah, maybe they will take like that, and then bishop rook takes and bishop takes e6. So this is not playable for black. Please notice the pin along the hidden pin, so to speak, on the a to g8 diagonal, f5 unplayable after pawn takes bishop h6. But talking about f5, it's not playable here, but at this point, since the g pawn is still on the board, what Aleksenko did, he played it at here at this point instead. Now it's much stronger, because now this doesn't work. We can just take back, right? So he played f5 first. This means that whenever bishop h6 comes later, he might be able to play rook e7. But still, the game is very, very complex. And at this point, I think white made a mistake. They played in the game queen f3, but I think Arsovic, who analyzed this in the chess informant, he explained that the best choice would have been queen g2 instead, keeping the queen on the g file. So after g takes h5, bishop h6, it's tricky to play this now, because if we go rook e7, what do you think white would play? Aha, we have the same idea again. We can take, and if they take, we have this overloaded piece. So you got it. We will just take on e6. Very pretty. In this way, black would lose, because white gets back material here, and yeah, they win the game. So what to play then after queen g2? Arsovic explains that after g takes, bishop h6, black would have to go for a counterattack. We will talk about this, I think it's in the next chapter, right? Yeah, we'll go for a counterattack here. Also, white's king is a little shaky in the center, so we can start attacking it. How can we do that? Exactly. Knight takes d2, and knight takes d4, and after e takes d4, queen b5 check. Suddenly, black's pieces wake up. You can see that the queen would like to settle here. There is something with the rook coming to c3 also. White will have to play king e1, and after queen b4, it will be a draw here. King e2, queen b5. I think you can't go this way, because rook c3 would be too scary, I think, for white. So we can't really settle on that square. I was just curious about what happened if king e3. Would we play rook c3 and king f4? Maybe e5. No, e5 is illegal. We can't play that. The bishop is hanging. So there must be something else here. If you can see it, yeah, let me know. What might it be? Some smart tactic here after king e3. Or maybe you can play something like f4 and you make them lose coordination. Yeah, that's possible, right? That's probably a better move, because if they go king f3, we can go rook c3, and if they play king takes f4, we can probably play here. Wow, I'm getting lost in the tactics here, but queen f5 looks very promising, right? I think something like that, queen f5, and if king back, we can go rook c3, and yeah, you can see it's now white who is in trouble. So something along these lines is what could have happened here. If queen g2, black has to find this move, knight takes d4, e takes d4, queen b5, and white will probably have to play king e1, avoiding the entrance of the rook. Yeah, king e1, you can see there is no back rank mate because of bishop takes e1. So queen b4, king e2, and it would probably be perpetual here. But in the game, white instead, after the move f5, they played queen f3, and now black noticed that they can actually take on h5, because after bishop h6 there was a trick here, a very nice trick. It's not knight takes d4, because in this case after e takes queen b5, you can see that white has queen d3. So Aleksenko found a very nice move here, which I would like you to find also. What's the difference if the queen is on f3 instead of g2? Yeah, one difference, as we said, if knight takes, pawn takes, they can cover with queen d3. But there is a dark side also to queen f3. There is an additional move here, option for black, based on a counter threat. That's completely right. Aleksenko played here knight e5. Beautiful. We are being attacked, but we attack ourselves. Knight e5, if they take on g7, we just take with the queen, and we end up in a better endgame. If d takes e5, you can see that now the king is in trouble, because of the queen b5, there is no queen d3, and also since the pawn is on e3 on this occasion, they didn't take like that, well, the bishop cannot cover c1. So now white is in big trouble. They played in the game king e1. Going that way, it just invites another black piece to the party. So king e1, rook c1, The king has to go back here, I think. If they play king d2, if nothing else, we can just take on g1. So bishop d1, and here Aleksenko simply continued with the attack, seeing no ghosts. Rook d8, very nice, because of the rook takes g7, king h8. White is missing a check here, and we're about to take on d1 also, maybe some other threat. Queen b4 perhaps. Rook g8, last desperate option. King takes. Sorry, I was going to say king takes, but that's probably a bad idea, right? Yeah, king takes, it's my mistake. Yeah, the queen would enter. Yeah, don't do that, please. Rook g8 instead. Now we have rook g1 coming up. White played bishop g5 in order to block the rook and try to take. But you can see that with such a heavy material advantage, there simply must be something. And I think what he played in the game was very nice. He found a simple way of neutralizing White's attack. He gave check on b4, queen b4 check, and after king f1, he played queen. Exactly, queen g4. Very nice. No queen takes anymore. And White, I think they resigned here at this point. There is no way to continue here. For example, bishop check, simply king h7, and nothing's going on here. We can always move up the king to g6 if they take on b7. Long, complex example, but main point here is that when they take on h5, we actually had a third choice. Take, accept the sacrifice, but one move later. We insert this useful intermediate move so as to clear space for our rook in the spirit of the defensive pawn break, you could say. And Black was okay in this position. Let's check another situation, you could say. In our next example, it's not really about facing a sacrifice. It's quite the opposite. In this game between Pepe Cuenca with the white pieces and Cayetano playing black, what Cuenca noticed was that rook takes g2. I think Black just played this move, right? Yeah, they just played rook g4. They have the threat of queen takes f3, but also you could say maybe they want to take like that and play bishop h3. In fact, this is a famous attacking method which is sometimes used. I have seen it with White, for example, in the Italian on some occasion where you would play. Yeah, how do you get there? You play rook takes. Yeah, good question. Yeah, how do you actually bring about this sacrifice? But I have seen it. Yeah. In any case, with knight takes d7, I think it is. I have seen it something with knight takes, king takes, and bishop h6 with White. I've seen it, I think, in the Italian. Maybe in the French, Taras also. In any case, what happened here is that White said, I don't really believe in this threat. I'm fairly well organized. I have my pieces in good places. And also he backed this up by concrete calculations. So White played here simply h3. It's about inducing the opponent into a sacrifice which is not sound. So that's what he played here, h3. Very clever move, because after rook takes, of course Black could go back, but it would be a psychological, you could say, setback for them. And also White was, I think, having a better pawn structure. You could take the pawn on d6, now you have an extra pawn. So let's see what happens if Black goes all in. Rook takes d2, well, we take it after bishop takes h3. What White had calculated here was actually we can get away with this. We can take on h3. We can be brave here. We have seen that our king can actually sneak back like that. If you don't play like that, if you say, oh no, I'm scared of this, let's play king g3 instead, you give Black additional chances. Queen f5, with the idea queen g4. You would have to find knight h2, and it seems you're okay here also. You can always meet a check on e5, I think by f4, but yeah, it's simpler what he played in the game. He just took on h3. After queen takes, king h2, bishop e5, king d1, queen g4, king f1, we go that way instead. As simple as that. No reason to stay on the king side anymore. After queen h3, we simply continue the walk towards the center, king e2, queen g4, and here we should not play. I mean, we can play it, no king d3, but then we have to go back after queen f5. So the point here is that we can simply play f3, and after queen g2, it's best to play king d3. Yeah, don't play bishop f2 because they get some extra possibilities with bishop g3. So king d3, it's actually, I think all the moves were basically forced here, or almost forced. So yeah, definitely calculation based. King d3 after queen takes f3, king c2, you can see that Black's attack is over. White has a serious material advantage, and they actually won the game even earlier. Black had already resigned at this point, but this is difficult for Black to defend, of course. They don't have enough material for the rook here, and yeah, White can soon start their own play and yeah, win the endgame and so on, trade off the bishop or something like that. So yeah, nice thinking by Pepe Cuenca. He noticed that this was actually not really a serious threat. We can call their sacrifice, so to speak, by playing h3 or force them into a dubious sacrifice. That's what he did in this case. Okay, it's time to turn the page and look at the opposite situation, where we actually should not accept the sacrifice, because this is not reality. It's not like every time they sacrifice we accept. That's not true. We will have a look at the other side now in this very famous and nice game. It's one of my favorites, Keres versus Smyslov. We're back in the 1950s, I think, in the Zurich Candidates Tournament, fantastic book written by David Bronstein, and I think he covers this example here. So what happened here is that Keres played some kind of Colle setup with white, and he wanted to go for an attack. He was a great attacking player, Paul Keres. So what he did here, he went for the intuitive attacking move, Rook CH3. Yeah, who wouldn't think about this move? It looks very fancy, no? To try to attack along the H file. What Keres had noticed was that if Smyslov accepts the sacrifice, G takes, Queen takes, threat of mate, of course, and if Rook E8, what do you think Keres had prepared? There is something called looking at the whole board, and here it applies. If you just look at the king side, you will see that black's king will escape. But please look at the queen side also. Aha, you got it. There is this fantastic move, a4 to put the bishop on a3. Funnily enough, but in this way you see that these two squares are covered, so black's king cannot just escape, just like that. I looked at this, I think other authors also looked at this example. What I looked at was if black plays something like queen d6, trying to prevent the bishop's arrival at a3. But white could now play this move, very clever to threaten rook g3, and also the bishop is in the air, because now the queen is not defending it properly. If bishop d7, how does this variation go? Yeah, definitely don't play this. I was going to say this, but okay, that's a major mistake. So yeah, now we would take on h7, and only then I think we play rook g3, right? Now we play it, and after bishop f6, again, look at the whole board and you will find exactly this move. Very clever, because now we're clearing the path for the bishop, and at the same time, if they take, we have more pressure also like that. So this would be very difficult for black to handle this position. So yeah, what happened in the game was that Smyslov said, okay, I can't really take after rook ch3. I can't really take, but maybe I'm not getting killed if they take on h7. Maybe I can survive after that, he was saying. I have a strong bishop here, like a dragon bishop on f6, covering this square. Maybe I can still survive here. And he played d takes c4. So in the first place, we should notice that if white just takes back, in that case, black has additional options because the bishop can go to e4. So black would now take on h5, and it's a different story. Bishop takes, bishop e4, and the bishop can come to g6. Like mobilization to the defense, black would be perfectly fine here. So after d takes e4, Keres had to go all in. He played rook takes h7. You would be scared to death here, right? With the black pieces. Two rooks on the h file. He's trying to bring in the queen also, and it would be mate basically. However, Smyslov, he kept his head cool here. He played c3. What's the point? Well, we would like to deflect white's pieces from the attack, like distraction in the defense, so to speak. If they take with the bishop, we could take on c3. You can see that they have a rook here which is overloaded, so they could not keep things going. So Keres had to play instead. If he moves the bishop, we can take on d4. Then this is very nice, because now we have this square controlled by three pieces now, which is enough to keep things under control. Queen c1 was played in the game. Now, of course, you should not take on b2. This was the beautiful variation prepared by Keres, or what he had going here. Queen h6, and as you can see, mate is coming up. If queen takes d4, we defend against the mate on h8, but we don't defend against the mate on, you got it, on h7. So rook g7 or rook h8, this would lead to mate here. So what Smyslov did, he didn't take the bishop, of course. He took on d4 instead, so that he has this square covered. Now he gets to the same variation with an extra tempo, you could say, because he didn't play c takes b2 yet. After queen h6, since this was a threat, or that, what do you think black should play? Aha, you remember the chapter about making space? That's where we are right now. We should make space for the king, rook ft8. In this way, the king escapes. Even if white gets this check in, we can always run with the king, as you can see. It would be a bad endgame for white. Yeah, we can look at this, of course. Rook h8, 8. Rook h8, bishop takes, queen check, king f8, queen takes, take, and king e7. Yeah, white is suffering here, of course. They won't save this endgame. We have the passed pawn and so on, extra exchange. So bishop c1 was played in the game. And after bishop g7, white's attack had come to a dead end. They tried queen g5, but after queen f6, it was black who was attacking. You can see that there are even ideas such as rook d1 coming up next, fighting on the first rank. So very nice display by Smyslov in this example. Keres' attack looked really scary, but Smyslov noticed that he could actually defend here, but it was vital not to take this time from h5. That would just open up for Keres a beautiful attack along the h file with this move a4 coming up also in some variation. So it was important not to take. It was smarter to play d takes e4 ignoring, he could say, the sacrifice, or well, maybe not ignoring, looking for counterplay, he could say also, by means of c3 and queen takes d4 and things like that. So very nice display by Smyslov. Let's check a more recent example. In this game between Kozul with white and Berkic with the black pieces. In a typical Catalan, white sacked 2 pawns, but you can see they have a lot of activity. The rooks are on the open file. Black's king is a little, you could say, uneasy on g8 because white's pieces are there, and you can see bishop takes h6 is in the air and so on. And that's exactly what happened in the game. Kozul played here bishop takes h6. So how would you react with black? Can we get away with taking, or should we do something else? As we were discussing, when all the pieces are in good places for the attacker, very often the sacrifice can be a logical culmination of the, or continuation of the attack. So we should probably look for ways to avoid the sacrifice, to avoid the acceptance. We can't avoid the sacrifice, it's already there, but we should try to find a way to live with this situation and accept that they have taken. So one thing that comes to mind here is, of course, queen takes e5, trying to trade queens, which would be helpful for black. But what Berkic must have noticed is that after queen takes, knight takes, there is a very annoying move here, rook d8. White is immediately taking control of the last rank, and black has tactical problems here. I looked a little at this, but yeah, safe to say this is difficult. Rook takes his mate. If you take on h6, it's the exchange down. I think rook f8 was the only move here, and white had something here. What did they play here? Bishop f4. This was very clever. First forcing them to play f6, and then I think there was something with going after this pawn, right? What did I play here? Bishop h7 check, king f7, and bishop g6, I think. Yeah, exactly. Bishop g6, as you can see, we're trying to take the exchange here. They would have to play like that. And now we're ready to get at this pawn. I think we take and we give check and we play rook g8. Is that so? Yeah, rook g8, exactly. Like that, you can see this is coming. We have this still in the pockets, and the h-pawn is going to be very important in this endgame. So that doesn't really work out for black. Queen takes e5. Instead, in the game, what black did, they accepted the sacrifice. I think there is also a modern tendency to always accept, but careful with that. There are situations like this one where it will backfire, this decision. So what happened in the game was that Kozul took on g6, of course, pawn takes, queen takes, king f8, only move to protect the rook. Queen takes h6, queen g7. Perhaps black calculated up to this point and they were saying, all right, I'm fine here. They don't have any concrete threats, but look what happened. Queen h5. Very strong move, because now rook d8 cannot really be avoided. It's disastrous for black if the rook lands on the 8th rank. So they played queen f7 in the game, queen h8 check, queen g8, queen h4. The same idea again. It's repeated again. White is just waiting to play rook d8. We can't avoid it. They tried in the game b5, rook d7, bishop, rook d8, bishop e7, and now rook 1 d7. Beautiful move. You can see what's going on here. We have one mating threat here. We have another mating threat, I think, there, and this is perhaps a third mating threat also. Yeah, too much for black to handle for sure. They resigned at this point. So very nice example of when you are faced with a sacrifice, you can't always just take it. That would be arrogant to think that they cannot do like this against me or something like that. You have to be very objective when you handle this situation. So b5, that would have been the best move here for several reasons. The most important one, that it helps us to quickly develop surprising move. Why would you play on the queen side? Well, you have this passive situation on the queen side. You need to bring out the pieces. This bishop is a giant, you could say. The bishop on e4 is very important. So we would really like to trade it off. I looked at some variations here. If you take on g6, we can just take back, and queen f7. You can see white, they don't have the right tools here to get at black's king. We would have bishop e7 and queen f3 coming up next, and so on. Well, we should, of course, be careful about rook d7, but we could maybe prepare for this in some way. Queen g4, rook b7 is what I have. Exactly. Yeah, don't let them play rook d7. Maybe we can play rook d7, and we can... I mean, after all, we had an extra pawn in the beginning here. It's equal, but we have something going on this side also in the future. So black would be okay in this position. After b5, bishop g5 is perhaps more testing. White would like to play rook d8, but what we can do here, back to the chapter about defensive sacrifices, we can actually give up the queen for rook and minor piece by playing here bishop b7. So when white plays rook d7, we can just take on d7, and then on e4, queen takes, rook takes, bishop takes e4. We're back in chapter 25, I think it was. As you can see, black is now I was going to say material down, but they're probably not material down, right? It's equal in material, I would say. But it's a pleasant position for black because white's attack is not that promising anymore. And definitely black is looking for ways to also attack here. And white's king is slightly exposed on the light square. So I think this is okay for black. Some kind of fortress thinking, or the bishop is powerful in the center and so on. So yeah, that would have been a different story. Not easy to see all this, of course, but main takeaway from this example, in my opinion, after bishop takes h6, please don't restrict yourself to the acceptance of the sacrifice. Once you notice that it's actually very, very dangerous, look for other options. We were 2 pawns up, so if we give back one of them, it's not the end of the world. Try to look for ways to develop. I use this exercise, or this example as an exercise with students, and it was not an easy one. Many of the students actually wanted to play queen takes e5, but b5, yeah, that's a surprising way to handle this position. You need to have an open mind to see moves like that, getting ready to play bishop e7, not fearing the loss of the queen and so on. All right, let's continue. We were talking about a few opening examples. My first opening example is this one. We're playing with the white pieces in an English battle, I think it is. Puranik with white and Ivic with the black pieces. What Ivic did here is a move that immediately, what could you say, it's pleasing to the eye. What he played here, he played knight f4. Pretty move. Black is exploiting the fact that white's king is in the center, and you can see that black's pieces are well developed and so on. So it's an enticing move. It's very logical, you could say, to play knight f4. So, accept or decline, what do you think? Should we just let the knight stay there, or do we have the guts to take it, actually? That's something to look into here. In the game, unfortunately, Puranik played bishop f1, careful choice, but this means that black gets away with something that they were not supposed to do. In this pawn structure, I would say, in this pawn structure, there's some kind of hedgehog structure, which I know rather well myself with the black pieces. You never want them to put a piece on d3, if you see what I mean. We don't want them to invade on this square. We never let them play. That's why you see a3 so often in the hedgehog structures, or a6 with black, because we don't want the knight to reach this square. So if they can play knight f4 and they can later land the knight on d3, they're like breaking the rules. Of course, we're caught by surprise here. We're caught by surprise, but still, that means that they have an easy ride, no, in the middle game if they can put something on d3. So that's perhaps an objection to bishop f1. But okay, we have to check the other variation, of course, when we take. So let's see what happens here first. Black play g6. You can see the point is to prepare bishop f5, rook g1. Bishop f5, queen b4, strange place for the queen. Never mind, there were not many squares available. Queen d5, powerful move by black, hitting the knight and getting ready to conclude development. Rook g3, and there we have the move that I don't like, to let my opponent play bishop d3. This is how the game went. Queen c3, rook a d8. The terrible game for white. You can see that their pieces are not in very good places, and also black has a fantastic grip on the light squares. And on top of it, they didn't sacrifice anything to get here. They got it for free, so to speak. So now let's have a look at what they should have played, but you will see that actually I'm painting it as an easy choice. It was not an easy choice, of course, because you really have to delve into this other variation, which is very complex. So, of course, by now you know that the right choice was to take, but we have to understand why. So e takes f4, black, of course, takes back. Now we have big issues on the e file, but don't forget we have a piece to suffer for at this point, so we should just try to find our way. Queen c4, important move, so that they can't bring the queen to d5 just like that. If they play bishop e6, they are temporarily blocking their bishop. Yeah, in fact, if they go bishop e6 here, we can play queen c3. This is very clever, because don't forget about black's king. In this case, we would win an important tempo, and also you can see it's not easy for black to just like that defend against the threat of mate on g7. So it's good to put the queen on c4 for several reasons. So after queen c4, black's obvious move here is bishop g4, because now you can see there is the threat of bishop takes f3. At this point, we can't really hang on to the material anymore. It would be very dangerous. Yeah, if you play queen c3 now, I think there is a problem also with bishop e5 at some point. Yeah, what will black play here? Interesting. Maybe we can play something like queen d5 or queen e7. No, queen e7 we cannot play. The bishop is there. So what will black play here? Interesting. Yeah, I didn't remember having looked at this, but maybe queen d5, and if bishop b2, it's always interesting to take here maybe. I think it's something like that, right? Okay, I'm trying my luck here. Rook takes, king takes, bishop takes, queen takes, and exactly we bring in the rook. Something along these lines might happen if white insists with this idea of queen c3. So in my main line, I actually have instead the handover of the material. We give back the bishop now on e2. So what do you think? Castle long or castle short? It's maybe surprising, but it's actually better to castle short. One reason for this is that actually black's attack is a little blocked by the pawn on f4. And also, I think it's about something else, right? Yeah, I'm trying to remember what was the other reason why this is so important. Yeah, because when they play b5, this is the way they get back the piece, right? We can take on c6. If we had a king on c1 now, well, then you would have issues along the c file. So that's probably the main reason why we castle short. After rook takes e2, here we have the last detail that we have to see when we embark upon this path. If you go rook fe1 here, black has the move queen e8. Yeah, this was a very important tactical move. So that after queen takes e7, bishop takes f3, rook takes, queen takes, bishop b2, rook e8. Yeah, this is the point, and black is threatening to play queen e1. Now imagine having this position with the rook on f1. If it was there already, I mean, what do you think white will play? Exactly, we will play queen c3, and we'll have a very nice attack. So yeah, this was very hard to see in our calculations, of course. So I admit the choice is difficult, but it's an interesting tactical detail here. Something about secrets thinking, I would say. Once you see that queen e1 is a threat, you actually say, oh, I should put the other rook on e1. So rook ae1 instead, and after queen e8, this is the way black can try to keep the pressure along the e file. We can then take on c7, and when they take on f3, we take on e2, and when they take back, now we can play bishop e2. As you can see, now the threat of queen c3, it's very, very serious. Black will have to bail out to a draw here one way or another. Bishop e4 we can just take, and the queen is coming home. So they could play something like bishop g2 here, flashy move, so that after king takes, queen g4, it's ultimately going to be a draw here. They cannot win because f3, we can always bring back the queen. What we have seen here is that knight f4 was a really powerful move. Black had every reason to count on success with this move. White had a difficult choice. In the game, they didn't want to take on f4 to avoid pressure along the e file, but in the game after bishop f1, black played g6, and later on they were able to install a piece on d3. This was very unpleasant for white in the long run. So what they had to do instead was to actually take the knight, accept the challenge on this occasion, and after e takes f4, queen c4, they still had good chances of saving this game, but they should be ready to castle short. Unexpectedly, this was the safest place for the king. One key idea here for white was to try to launch counterplay by means of bishop e2 and queen c3 later on. So difficult choice, not easy at all, which shows the complexity of this topic of dealing with sacrifices. In our next example, we actually have the opposite situation. In this position from the Queen's Gambit accepted, a game between Halkias with white and Pichot with the black pieces. Halkias hurried to play here the move knight takes h7. And this is actually the opposite situation. White has so many pieces in the attack. It's a little like Smyslow's example, you could say. It's simply too dangerous to take on h7. That's what Pichot did in the game. He took on h7, very brave move, but unfortunately this didn't work out well. Maybe he was expecting queen h5, which I think would also work, but in the game, Halkias instead gave check like this. This was smarter because after king g8, you can see that rook h5. There is no way we can play g6 due to this pin, the hidden pin along the a2 g8 diagonal. We cannot play g6 here. This would be mate. So after knight takes h7, king takes h7, queen d3 check. He had to play here instead, I think, the move f5 he played in the game. And now white played here in a nice fashion. Queen h3 check. The king cannot go back, of course, because the bishop is there. They had to play king g6. And how do you think white opened up more space for their attack? Very nice move. g4, pretty attacking idea. Queen h5 is coming up next with basically mate. Black cannot take because it's basically the same thing here with queen h5 and mate coming up very soon. We also have the bishop that we can use for attacking purposes. So yeah, black had a difficult time here and they soon lost the game. So we should not take on this occasion after knight takes h7. It's simply too much to take there. Too many pieces here. Not every day white has a rook on d5, by the way. So a better choice. Somehow give up the material here. Bishop e6, this was the right choice. In this way, we lose a pawn in this transaction, but it means that also we normalize the position a little. We don't run into strong attack. After knight takes f8, bishop takes d5, bishop takes, rook takes f8. You would say, of course, that white is better here. They have the bishop pair and so on, open position. However, there is one interesting detail. We have a pawn on c5, which is usually on h7 instead. Like in my game versus Ionescu in the introduction, we had something like that. This makes a big difference. Of course, you could say black's king safety is harmed by this absence of a pawn on h7. On the other hand, we have a stronghold on d4, for the knight especially. That makes a big difference here. So basically, black wouldn't have big problems here, provided that they use that stronghold on d4. White cannot really attack so well anymore, so not so many pieces left. So something like bishop e3, we can start with rook d8 development, and after rook d1, now we play knight e4. You can see the point, if they take on d4, we can just take back on d5 in that case, and yeah, we're not even worse here in this position. So after knight e4, white would keep their bishop pair by means of queen h5. You can see, as always, g6 is not good due to queen takes d6, but we could play something solid here, like bishop f6. In this way, we protect the pawn on f7, and also we strengthen our knight on d4. Black will be perfectly fine in this position. So this was perhaps a simpler example than the previous one. The previous one was very chaotic, I admit. This one is rather simple in comparison. After knight takes h7, what black should do, they should not take that knight. It's simply too dangerous. White has 4 pieces in the attack, and 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, exactly. Queen, rook, bishop pair. While black doesn't have so many defenders, so it's clever actually to bring out the pieces instead, something like bishop e6. Of course, you can ask yourself then what happens if white, they don't take on f8, they go for an attack by rook h5, but somehow they don't have the right pieces here to attack us. We can take on c4 first, and after queen takes c4, as you can see, white has the back rank also to be worried about. Something like rook fd8 would be a good move here, threatening mate and also getting rid of the rook. I don't think this is that dangerous. After all, the knight is not ideally placed, you could say, in this situation. Bishop f4 is what I looked at, and then I think queen d7 was very clever, because we again threaten mate, and I can think we can do some other things with the queen, like, for example, send her to g4 or something like that. So black would be probably okay in this position. So interesting situation. Knight takes h7 looked very powerful, but black could actually just what would you say, ignore this threat. They could play here instead bishop e6, getting ready to take back, and later on they would rely on this stronghold on d4. So our last example is from an endgame situation. I wanted to show you that also in the endgame these situations can appear. The opponent sacrifices something, and we have to make a choice whether to accept or decline. So in our last example, we have with white pieces Ivic, and playing black is Vaishali. Ivic is having, I think, an extra pawn here. 1, 2, 3. Yeah, white's up a pawn, but it's not so easy for them to progress. It's a very closed position, and black has nice pressure against b3, tying up white's rook to the defense of that pawn. What Ivic noticed was a hidden resource on the opposite side of the board. He played here the move g6. So what do you think? Should we take that pawn, or should we just leave it? If we take it, we re-establish material balance, but okay, maybe we're opening up the g-file for their rooks. Aha, that's right. In the game, they took on g6. Vaishali took the pawn, but that was a bad choice. Suddenly, white started a mating attack. That happens sometimes in the endgame, by the way. There are mating possibilities in the endgame, as I think we saw in some other example. After rook d1 check, king f7, what you can see here is that rook d2 won't work, of course. Black would take on b3. So how do you think white fixed this little detail? How can they actually insist with the idea of doubling rooks on the d-file? Aha, you got it, b4. What a nice move. Another sacrifice, but this is, yeah, about something else. It's just about winning time for the attack. b4, and now if we take back on b4, we take on b4, I mean, then rook g2 is just killing. There is mate coming up, as you can see, with the 2 rooks. Very often, actually, in endgames with 2 rooks, there are mating possibilities. So after b4 in the game, Vaishali played rook f8, I think, instead. Did she play that? No, that's how the game went. Sorry, now she played rook f8. And now white, they can't bring about that mate we just saw, but there are other possibilities. Of course, rook g7 check, rook e7 check, I was going to say, but I think she played that next move, no. Oh, no, she didn't. He didn't play that, sorry. Yeah, I'm even losing track of who is playing white and black. No, Ivic, he took first on b4. I think this was perhaps not not working. Rook e7, king d8, rook g e7, what was I thought, but maybe black can just play rook b7. Yeah, this would be not the right choice, of course, for white. So in the game, what they did was they played 8x before. So why do you think they played that? What was the point of 8x before? Aha, they have discovered a different angle for their attack. They now know that they can put the rook on this side. Yeah, very clever to mate black like that, or ultimately bring the rook like this. Yeah, very inventive play by Ivic in this endgame. C takes before rook a1, rook b8. As you can see now, if rook a7, black could that. Yeah, that also works, right? Yeah, I'm getting the wrong picture here. Of course, this will also work, pretty mate. But he played first rook e7, and then after king d8, he played rook a7. Yeah, in any case, we can see what's going on here. Black is going to lose that pawn on d7, on d7. White's rook can come back. They have the c pawn. They can take care of the h pawn with the king and so on. So white is winning, and yeah, they later on prevail in this game. So it was actually a wrong choice after g6. We shouldn't take. We open up too much possibilities for white. We can't do many things in this position since the pawn is actually looming forward. It's better to control it with the king. If white insists, again, yeah, we shouldn't let them carry out that attacking plan. It's much safer to just play king h7, so that when they take, we can now take with the rook instead. This would be the key idea here for black, and they don't have anything to worry about. Their king is safe. So white could try something else here after king h7. b4 at once would be one idea, but after pawn takes b4, rook g1, yeah, crazy variation here. What white is trying to do is pawn takes, rook takes, and queen, right? But we have no reason to enter this. First, we can block the pawn by playing king g8. It's interesting. It's almost like the, if you remember the umbrella pawn or the pawn shield on g7. We're using this pawn as a shield for our king. Even in the endgame, you can do something like that. White is having some issues on the b file. They shouldn't let black enter there, so a4 perhaps, and we can play here king f7, bringing the rook to g8. I would say the battle is far from over, but safe to say black is much safer here than in the game. So that's what could have happened here in this example. White played in the game, inventive move g6. Black should not take that pawn. They give too much activity for white by means of this plan rook g2, b4, and rook bg1. It was safer for black to simply ignore the sacrifice. We keep everything under control here. This would have been a safer choice. But of course, in the endgame, then we are not having too much time on the clock. So it's a tough choice, of course. Only by calculation we can really establish this, the choice here. But of course, we're talking about here simply checking the different options and not ruling out any possibility. That's basically the idea here. All right, so what we have seen here in this chapter, we started with some situations with a Greek gift. We saw that this Greek gift didn't work out. Black should accept the sacrifice. It was correct to accept the sacrifice because later on, after accepting it, they can bring the queen to f5 where it will cover the h7 square. In our next example, we saw that it was again correct to accept the sacrifice, but the king should go up to g6. This was important within the Greek gift if we cannot control the h7 square. We saw in Korchnoi example that it was okay to take the knight on g3, but we had to see this little, what can I say, defensive combination with bishop d5 and queen e1, queen takes d3, queen h2, giving back the piece on h3, but making it sure that we can obstruct black on the h file. We saw Judith Polgar sacrifice on f5. Belyavsky correctly accepted the sacrifice because he knew that he could later on give back material. That's something which I perhaps forgot to say in the introduction. Very often you can accept and later on you can give back. That's what both Korchnoi and Belyavsky did in these two examples. This rook e6 move was very important because it allows black to play knight f8 later on, covering the square on h7, which was, of course, of key importance in this example. We saw in the Grunfeld battle between Tran Tuan Minh and Alexienko that black was faced with this move, rook takes h5, the sacrifice. Taking it at once, taking on h5 at once was dangerous due to bishop h6, but if we play f5 first, we win the precious time because we can put the rook on e7. Then he was actually okay to take on h5, but only if he was then ready for a counter sacrifice with knight takes d4 or knight e5. Yeah, very interesting example. We saw in the next example how Pepe Cuenca simply induced his opponent into taking the pawn on g2, sacrificing on g2. He had calculated correctly that nothing would happen, almost like, playing poker, like we are seeing through the bluff or something like that. Very useful move, h3, useful idea, I would say. when you have noticed that your opponent's sacrifice is not correct, you can actually invite them into that sacrifice. We saw quite the opposite in this old game, classical battle, Kere-Smyslov. Smyslov didn't take on h5. It was too dangerous on this occasion to accept the sacrifice. He allowed white to pile up on the h file because he opened up for counterplay in the center with c3 and queen takes d4. We had a look at the Catalan battle where white sacrificed on h6, preparing a deadly attack on the king side. Black should not accept on this occasion the sacrifice. It was much safer to play this move b5, key move, so as to prepare development of the bishop to b7 and quickly get some activity, even not shying away from sacrificing the queen in the spirit of defensive sacrifices. So, a nice example about sometimes we could keep our head cool and we don't just accept the sacrifice because we think that we have to do it. No, we can look at other options also. We saw in the opening battle between Buranik and Ivic, this was a very complex example. Black put the knight on f4, white should have accepted it, but then they had to walk a really thin line in order to keep the game going. It was important to understand this, giving back the material, giving back the bishop on e2, but castling short to safeguard the king and later on build up counterplay on the long diagonal with queen c3 and bishop b2. We saw the game between Halkias and Pichot. Halkias sacrificed on h7. This time it was not advisable to accept. It was much safer to play bishop e6, developing, trading. Even if white gets the bishop pair, we saw that black's position will be rather safe, which cannot be said about what happened in the game. King takes h7. It was just too brave. White had too many pieces in the attack. Exploiting this strong rook on d5, their attack became really unparable. And in our last example, we saw how Ivic sacrificed the pawn with g6, and Vaishali should not take that pawn. It was dangerous to let white's rooks come back into the battle after this preliminary move b4. It was safer to just ignore it and walk all the way down with the king, and if they play g8, well, we will take it with a rook definitely. In this way, we keep our king safe. All right, thanks, and see you in the next chapter.